Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Alright, hello everyone, welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is CB Robertson. This is episode 38, take 2. No promises on the quality of this one, I'll do the best I can. My outline is not quite as thorough as I would normally like, but we'll see how it goes. So about 3 years ago, I wrote a blog post called Capitalism Doesn't Exist. Or Capitalism Does Not Exist. Doesn't exist. And, in going back over that, I realized I could have written it better. And it became a particularly pertinent point to bring up because I had the privilege of speaking with Jack Donovan for Pater and the podcast he's been putting out about sorcery and about magic. Those should be coming out sometime in the next week or two. Those will be really fun. I think you guys will enjoy that very much. But they're not out yet. And I made the point that the word capitalism, not ist. Capitalism is an excellent example of sorcery, of conjuring a foe out of nothing and changing the world through words in that way. And I realized that's a fairly bold claim, because the existence of capitalism is something that for most people is a fairly well-established thing. And so first of all, why create such a term? Why would such a term be created? And second, what's the purpose of challenging this term? What's the purpose of taking this down? And isn't capitalism so viscerally, obviously existing? Isn't it all around us? What's this all about? And I thought, since the blog post, in going back and reading it, it could have been written better, we might say. I thought I might as well try to bring that argument, if not up to a higher standard of presentation in my in my current state. I'm not drunk or anything. I'm just feeling a little off, feeling a little tired, kink in the neck, that kind of thing. Then at least in an audio format, where I know you podcast listeners enjoy getting your intellectual stimulation from. So I will do the best with what I have here. So let's talk about these words, because again, this is not a podcast about economics. This is a podcast about words, and that's going to be a very important point to remember going forward, even though words have a dramatically powerful influence in the way that we think about economics, which is it gets more mind-blowing the more you think about it. I'll let you dwell on that on your own time, and in the meantime, we'll jump in here. So what is capitalism? I don't normally like using Wikipedia, but here the definition offered by Wikipedia is pretty serviceable, and it quotes some other outside source that I'm sure is more reputable, but the source is less important than the correctness of the given definition. And it reads, quote, "Capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit." Now, I chuckle at the for profit part at the end there, because what is profit? Well, you're doing things to earn money. What is money? Money is a fungible medium of exchange that stands in the place of things we hold in value. All it is a tool for trading. And so when we say for profit, you could just as easily rewrite the definition to say for value, which it hits a little different when you put it that way. There's something immoral sounding about doing things for profit. But if you're doing things for value, well, that's that's quite commendable. Who doesn't like value? Anyways, a sort of digression that is relevant to the point in question. So when they say the means of production, that's a long stand-in phrase for capital, because capital, which is a much older term than capitalism, we'll get to that in a minute. Capital is defined, and here I'm quoting from some textbook, I don't remember the title, but those durable produced goods that are in turn used as productive inputs for future production. So you think like a factory is like a go-to example of capital. But you could also say, I have a lawn mowing business, maybe. My lawnmower is capital. It's a durable produced good that I then take and turn around and use it as an input for further production to provide goods and services to other people. Now, I'm not actually a professional lawnmower. I'm an electrician. So I have a bunch of power tools and strippers and linemen and screwdrivers and normal electrician tools. And those are all at a kind of, low level, but a meaningful level to me, capital. They're all, durable produced goods that I use in turn as productive inputs for more production. Now, and it's worth mentioning, capitalist, which is also an older term than capitalism, is simply one who possesses capital. Now, the important word in our definition of capitalism here, and this is not just a function of the precise wording of this definition, it's pretty ubiquitous, I think, is the word system. Capitalism is an economic system where private citizens own the capital. A system is a set of things working together for a common purpose. Let's use that as our definition. I think that's sufficiently broad that to excuse me of any charge of special pleading or creating special unique definitions that exclude our thing. A set of things working together for a common purpose. I don't think, there are economies that you can plan. But capitalism, as we've just defined, where private citizens are the ones who are doing things, and for profit, for their own ends. That's the other way of reading for profit. They're doing things with the means of production that benefit themselves. They're creating their own, client lists and trades and business interactions and so forth. They're doing that all in their own kind of organic manner, without any kind of top-down planning. One might say, without any kind of systematic planning. And here the word system is, I think, very appropriate. Capitalism, as it is generally thought of by most people, is not a system at all. It's in fact is defined in practice by the absence of a system. And here I'm talking about, Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations and, the Chicago School of Economics, who are generally held to be the champions of capitalism. These are your classic, your Thomas Sowells, your Friedrich Hayek's, Ludwig von Mises, that whole crowd. Very laissez-faire, very just sit back, let everyone sort out their own economic matters themselves. Values subjective. Everyone has different values. They'll create their own thing, and that's the best way to actually maximize production. That's a theory, but it's not a system. It's not something that you implement or design. We can think of systems in a very loose sense, I suppose. We can think of like an ecosystem is an environment, but it would be special pleading only used by, intelligent design advocates to say, oh, an ecosystem bears signs of having been created by like some, watchmaker, as some, pack of wolves is tearing a deer limb from limb. No, that's not, what you have is an emergent equilibrium. And that's what we have in, market economies that are less regulated. Equilibriums emerge on their own. But that doesn't mean it's a system in the sense of being implemented. It's not a policy, except insofar as a government may have said, hey, let's take a step back. But that's a negative action. That's not a positive action. So one could say, and I will add this to our notion of a system, because my central argument here, when I say capitalism doesn't exist, is that capitalism is not a system. And the word capitalism, that big ism appendage there, implies a kind of system or ideology. Now, there is an ideology that advocates less regulated markets, and that is, as I mentioned before, the Chicago School of Economics, also, maybe known as the Austrian School of Economics. There are slight differences. We won't get into that right now, but like that the ideology that says you get more production if you step back on regulation, if you have less government involvement, is separate from a system that is implemented and that guides the economy. So when we talk about capitalism, we are talking with the very word, which is defined as an economic system, as a system that is not a system. And this gets to the origins of the term, which I want to bring up and point out is a surprisingly recent word. I didn't know how recent it was until I looked into it at the time I was thinking these thoughts a little over 3 years ago. The term was coined in 1850. That was actually after Karl Marx started writing his philosophical and economic manuscripts. It was coined by a French socialist named Louis Blanc. And his quote is, "What I call capitalism, that is to say, the appropriation of capital by some to the exclusion of others." End quote. Now, of course, he's going to call it appropriation because there's this, égalité, fraternité ideology of like everything should belong to everybody because we're all, communists, except they didn't have that term back then, so they called themselves socialists. And Louis Blanc was a socialist activist. But I love that phrasing, to the exclusion of others. Yes, that's what private means. You presumably own yourself to the exclusion of others. Other people don't own you, because we would call that slavery, usually. Although there are other euphemisms for slavery now. I will dodge that digression. So it was a term coined by socialists in order to give expression, to give a name that implies a system to a non-system, and it implies not just a system, but a rather malicious system. Because again, Louis Blanc, in his definition here, is talking about appropriation. They took the means of production. The working class made it, but the bourgeoisie, which is a sort of middle, there isn't really an American equivalent to that. It was a particular class in France during the 19th century, a sort of merchant trading class. But like, let's take a step back and think a little bit about property. Who was the first person to create, let's say, a hammer? And we can go all the way back to Stone Age. Someone found a rock and was like, well, this rock works pretty well as a hammer, but what if we give it some leverage by tying it to a stick? Ooh, this is way better. And then the first hammer is created, and then someone makes an axe, and now they can cut down trees, or they can kill their enemies better. Those implements are owned by the individual who makes them. And, trade between individuals as individuals goes back, forever, but they aren't owned by an economic class. It's not owned by the working class. Now, a particular hammer might be shared among a family, perhaps even among a whole tribe, but not. No one thinks of themselves, perhaps until the 1850s in terms of economic classes. It was more along the lines of family or tribe, and then broader along the lines of religion, which is kind of an expanded tribe. And so the idea that the working class created these things, no, and like an individual or perhaps a group of individuals, if you're making a factory, makes these and pays for it. And there's a long conversation to be had about the nature of property and the nature of property ownership. And I will see if I can try my hand at getting a hold of Kurt Doolittle, our local expert on that, the proprietarian guy. But suffice to say, the presumption that capitalism and the ownership of capital necessarily happens by appropriation is quite audacious, to put it mildly. That is not the default assumption. You would have to assume it was stolen from someone else, but very oftentimes, and this can get very circular if you accept the labor theory of value, which I think we might have to do a whole podcast on Marxism at some point. But this, I want to shy away from Marxism properly, and I want to stick with this word capitalism and all of the assumptions, worked into the acceptance of this word and the implications of the word. And, we can believe that there were historical cases where, capital was seized and stolen. Obviously, of course, that's happened historically. But to say that capitalism is a system that is characterized by this theft, runs against the more general definition of, we're going to let private citizens own their own capital. That theft is not implied there. So you can see very quickly how dizzying some of these word games can get, which is the goal of trying to unpack some of these. So I will add that I think in order to be an economic system, to qualify as an economic system, the system has to have some kind of characteristic essence or spirit. Which is not to say that there aren't going to be, variations between different states that have a more mercantilist model, or different kinds of socialism, or the same kind of socialism that manifests in different ways in different countries. But the systems still have a tendency. And I think there's an idea that capitalism also has a kind of essence, a spirit. It has a tendency. It has that, Schopenhauer talked about the essence of technology was to turn all available resources and materials into standing reserves. And I think a lot of people have that notion about capitalism, that, it's all about money, and it's all about turning everything into money. It's about monetizing everything, and that's the nature of capitalism, and so forth. This is the sorcery at work. That belief emerged because the word capitalism made that thought possible. And I want to strongly disagree with the idea that capitalism has any kind of discernible essence or spirit. The essence or spirit that is ascribed to capitalism is, this thing of greed or want for money. But again, as I talked about before, money is just a stand-in for value. You to think that people just work for money in that gross sense. And there are people who go through, hoarding stages in their life for sure. But first of all, that happens in other economic systems too. They just do it through they pursue power through other means. Sociopaths climbing the political hierarchy within the Kremlin, or working up under your African warlord, or whatever you have to do. the human lust for power and recognition is not unique to capitalism. It just gives a different, mode of presentation for that. Because again, the thing being sought after is not money, but the thing that money stands in for, which is value. To believe that money motivates on its own in that way would require you to believe that the vast majority of billionaires never spend exorbitant amounts of money on fine art or music or aesthetic ventures of that kind, that they just monetize everything and everything at the end of the day, that nothing has value to them other than the money it brings them. I think that might be true of a few sociopaths, but it to me that is a reductio ad absurdum that any familiarity with the truly upper class immediately destroys. People acquire money because it's a stand-in for value. Were it not for money, they would be acquiring value in other ways, whether that's violence or social clout or the yams in your grain storage hut, whatever means of acquiring value are at your disposal. So to me, the essence of a society that we will call capitalist is not determined by the nature of money or the nature of capital. Rather, it's determined not by economics at all, but the absence of regulation means that the other aspects of society, the civil government, the culture, the geography, the religion, the ethnic history of the people who live there, the language itself, and the other civil laws and of the society in question, all of those are going to dictate what is held to be valuable in that society, and then what is believed to be valuable, what is believed to be of value, is then what is going to characterize that society. So anything you want to say critical about a country that is called capitalist is going to be a criticism of the value structure. Like perhaps we're in the Frankfurt School and we think, American society is so one-dimensional. American society, they care about superficial things. Well, what would be something that would be more worth caring about? Oh, I don't know. Preserving the environment. I don't know. Maybe deep philosophical conversations. I don't know. Truly great film. Well, those are all things that people could spend a lot of money on, or to put it another way, a lot of time and effort. Because, not to make a true equation out of a bit of a cliche, but it's true that time and money correlate. Effort and money are interchangeable. Now, not to be rude, not everyone's exchange rates are the same, but as a general principle, again, money is just a stand-in for value, and any criticism of the nature of a given capitalist society, which are different from each other. The culture of Hong Kong is very different from the culture of the United States, and there are other countries that are socialist in some ways but very capitalist in others, there is some cultural crossover in much of the Western Hemisphere that has more to do with our shared culture and our shared language and our shared growing religion. There is a religious discussion to be had about science and modernism and human rights and all that kind of thing. A very serious discussion to be had at another time. But again, many of the similarities that are being ascribed to capitalism, and again, this is the sorcery, are in fact not caused by capitalism. And when we think about it, almost could not be caused by capitalism, except except that we've been given this word that describes a non-system as a system, and then we are primed. We can be primed to interpret things around us that we don't like as a result of this non-system. And I'll give you a linguistic example. This is a particularly clever one because it's layered. This linguistic example. This is some medium high tier sorcery. Not high tier, but medium high tier. Have you ever heard the phrase late stage capitalism? Think about that. Probably a few memes, probably a passing reference by someone. Oh, such and such is a symptom of late stage capitalism. My wife was telling me the other day she saw some video where kids were they were marketing these toys to kids that replicated stay-at-home work desk setups, not cubicles, but like, oh, there's a desk and there's a laptop and there's like all these stuff you have at your stay-at-home workstation. And the joke was, late stage capitalism strikes again, or, something to that effect. As if the need to make money is so just all consuming and pervasive that, that they're now marketing the just working everywhere to children. How nefarious. That's what the phrase implies. What's actually going on is what's been going on for the last, million years, where kids emulate their parents, and their parents do all kinds of things to make money. It's not like people were going out farming during the 9th century for fun. They were going out to farm to eat, and then what was left over from what they didn't need to survive on their own, they could sell for money, and then they'd take that money and exchange it to buy a new mule, more grain, maybe some chickens. Oh, we'll get some lumber to add on, build a new shed, whatever the case may be. It's just simple emulation. But the phrase late stage capitalism brilliantly primes people to interpret things in a malicious manner, or in a manner in which money has somehow corrupted our very goals and values and things, as opposed to, oh no, we just do different things for work than we did for work 1,000 years ago. So that's the kind of sorcery I'm talking about, and I do mean sorcery literally. I think real sorcery is not fantasy magic with fireballs and that kind of thing. It is this kind of subtle use. Well, I'll leave it. I'll entice you with some ideas, so you'll go and check out my conversations with Jack Donovan. But it is this kind of manipulative use of words and phrases, and the creation of highly persuasive words and phrases that create a sense of legitimacy, and which change the world by changing how other people think about and even perceive the world. That's what all of these great and effective self-described alchemists and magicians have done. And I'm not talking about Aleister Crowley so much as I am about Georg Hegel and George Soros as a self-described alchemist. So anyways, so my argument distilled is that capitalism does not exist because capitalism is defined as an economic system, but what is ascribed to capitalism, an unregulated market, or a less regulated market, we can say, where private citizens can function as agents of their own, is not a system at all. It does not operate as a system, even though emergent equilibriums can be perceived and maybe called systems in the way that an ecosystem can be thought of as a system. Now, I sort of addressed there are, I think, 3 good counter arguments to this position I'm making. And I've already sort of made and addressed one of them. It's like, well, what about the nature of money? Doesn't the nature of money have some influence? And you could point back to like Sparta and trying to make trade itself more difficult, which is why they made iron money. And when you're talking about the corrupting nature of money, what you're really talking about is the corrupting nature of trade, because trade is the only reason that we would have money. And so perhaps you could make a sort of primitivist argument for, well, you should do more things yourself, and you won't have as nice things, but you'll be a more virtuous person. And, you know, with teamwork in a community, you probably won't be struggling to survive or anything. You'll be struggling to subsist comfortably, but, you know, maybe comfort isn't so great. That's a serious argument you can make. I think most people would not bite on that argument. I think most people, especially people with families and people with children, like a degree of comfort, because comfort equals safety for yourself and for your children. You know, and you know, people can get very macho and stoic about comfort, but it becomes a little bit less easy to brush off the value when it concerns the safety of your kids. And many of the things that the benefits of living in a society with indoor plumbing, potable water, electricity, electrical heating, gas heating, air conditioning, all that kind of stuff, does come down to life preservation. So the nature of money and the trade thing, I think, is a very shallow argument. The second argument against this position, capitalism doesn't exist, is an interesting one and is a nuanced one, and I think is actually a very serious one, where the sort of Austrian and Chicago schools of economics are concerned. And it goes like this: capitalism does exist because even if it isn't a system per se, it has a characteristic spirit. And that characteristic spirit comes from the international influence that free trade will inevitably bring about. Now, I won't go into too much detail with this counter argument, other than to direct anyone listening here to a fantastical, really, really enjoyable, at least for if you're an economics nerd, maybe not to most people, but it's a debate book. You don't see very many of those around, between Vox Day and an economics professor from the Chicago school about the question of free trade. And the title is literally on the question of free trade. I want to say the guy's last name was like Woods. I could be wrong on that. I'll have to double check that. But suffice to say, there are good arguments for limiting international free trade, because at a cultural level, international influence can be not just a characterizing spirit of a society, but a distinctly bad characterizing spirit of a society. So think of it as a more serious version of counter argument one, the nature of money, which is really trade. It's like, well, what about international trade? Okay, there is a point, I think, that serious people can understand the distinction, where international, like large scale trade, which Vox Day very compellingly argues necessarily involves not just a movement of capital, but a movement of labor as well, meaning people. And that can have some really deleterious effects on society, but also a characterizing spirit with that international influence. So I don't think it's a knockdown argument, because I think it is possible to have, less regulated markets within a controlled border. But the third counter argument, is one of the more interesting ones, and it's one I can't fully address, but I want to spend a little bit of time attempting to address here. And the third counter argument goes something like this: wouldn't capitalism have a characteristic spirit because because within a system with less regulated markets, there would be fewer commons. Now, a commons is a space or thing, an entity that is held collectively by a society. The classic philosophical example of a commons is the ocean. The ocean is not owned by anybody. There are very interesting legal books that my friend Augustus Invictus has mentioned on laws pertaining to the ocean and the distinction in nature between water and land, as far as how valid laws can even be in that regard. But the ocean is a valuable resource because we get lots of fish from the ocean. Fish is a mainstay staple of animal protein for people all over the world, and yet, no one owns it. So what happens if people overfish? What happens if people take more fish from the ocean than the ocean can naturally reproduce? This is, of course, in economics, I hope I'm not condescending to anybody, known as the tragedy of the commons. It's the idea that in a commons there is a tendency for people to freeload, to take more from the common shared space than what is than what's sustainable. Now, the ocean is like kind of a serious example because it's sort of a commons of necessity. But societies get a lot of their character and quality and the positive experience of living in a given society from the commons that they have. The streets that we walk are a kind of commons. And if the streets are filthy and dangerous, well, you can hide away in your gated community, kind of, but that's not really much of an existence. We want our society to have a kind of characteristic spirit to live in this place, and we want that to be a good characteristic spirit, and one that we can share with each other. There's a kind of, I hope I'm not insulting anybody, but a kind of adolescent libertarian argument that goes, well, let's just do away with commons, and then the tragedy of the commons is not an issue. And I say this as someone who used to make this argument. It is, I think, a very shallow argument. It's a very superficial argument, and it comes from a complete disconnection from what it is actually like to experience a society without commons. It's Matthew Crawford describes this very well in The World Beyond Your Head, where the problem with advertisements, which he also links back to words. He says we lack a moral language to talk about our own ownership of our own attention. So it's solvable in an almost legal manner. We need to change the words that we're using, and we can establish a kind of attentional commons in which shared experience of public places becomes possible again, and we can connect with each other without every time we go out in public we plug in our earbuds and look down into our phones in order to avoid the bombardment of the increasingly disrespectful of our attention outside world. But a digression, but also a recommendation there. Highly valuable book. And the point is that commons are important, and it is a capitalist society, i.e. a society with less regulated markets, is a society without some kind of regulation of some sort, characterized by a collapse of the commons, and therefore a kind of collapse of the shared spaces where interaction and relationship building happen. I think there's a couple of counter arguments to this counter argument. First of all, there are all kinds of positive shared experiences and relationship building that happen in a business environment. Now, off the bat, that can sound very grating. It's like, well, life isn't all about business. It's like, well, no, that you're correct. It's not all about business, but these commons, at least in like socialist societies or in the United States, are paid for by taxpayer money. The national parks that we have, which is another excellent American example of commons, are not free. They are sustained by a taxpayer foundation where we are paying for those. And so the difference between having relationships and shared experiences of our lives together in society in a business setting versus on your own and not in a business setting is they're a lot closer together than you think where money is concerned. Business, you in the construction world, you hang out with your buddies at lunch break and talk about whatever. You talk about the news, you talk about cool new toys you got, your new golf clubs, your new AR, your new boat, whatever the case may be. And then if you're really a good friend, or if you hit it off with each other, maybe you'll go hang out with each other, share some beers and talk about stuff, go for a hike, whatever, on weekends, or just go to a bar after work. That's a kind of real social existence that happens. And by the way, bars aren't commons either, nor are the houses that we hang out at together. Commons are not as necessary as commons of the kind that people who defend the commons are usually talking about for those kinds of shared experiences, as it's implied. Now, I still personally think there is some value in defending communism, and it is worth, or not communism, commons. A little slip there, because communists do want to make commons out of everything. There is some value to defending commons of that kind. And it is worth asking, do less regulated economies tend toward the dissolution of these commons? And the real answer, I want to say, aside from they are important, but they're not as like socially crucial as is often implied, is that the commons are not preserved on economic grounds. The commons the commons are not capital. And there's some fear that, like, if you have a less regulated economy, then the commons will be turned into capital. Yellowstone will become a theme park, or something like that. But what's actually happening with the preservation of many of these kinds of commons that we care about is not grounded in economics at all. It's grounded in civil law that exists outside of the economic thinking framework entirely. And again, to return to the point before, economics isn't everything. The nature of societies and the characteristic spirit of our societies are largely determined by our religions, our language, our geography, our broader culture, and the economics have less of an impact than we often imagine. Which is not to say they have no impact, but I think the preservation of commons matters, but it's almost not an economic question, and the means of preserving the commons are also not economic means. So the question, does a less regulated economy, does more private ownership of the means of production tend toward dissolution of commons? I think is as counterintuitive as this sounds, actually no, is actually not true, because commons are not preserved by alternative modes of economic system design. If anything, a more centralized economic system, a more planned, a more systematized economic system would, I think, be just as high of risk of trying to monetize and cash in on commons as a private society is. And I think really the scariest evidence of this is in the monetization of our attention and our minds in social media. And I think people could be forgiven for believing that these social media companies, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so forth, are private organizations. I think people could be forgiven for believing that 2 or 3 years ago. In light of what we've learned about, FBI and the CIA and broader government involvement with these and their access to the data that these organizations hold. The organizations may have come up with the mechanisms, but the seizing of those particular means of production appears to have been done at gunpoint by the state, or at least the state mandated that these companies turn over private information, and there were a few companies that didn't and that refused, and they went under, and they had to start over and do different things. So the insofar as the risk of the collapse of the commons is real and is economic in nature, you don't get away from that by leaving things in the hands of the state. They're just as likely, if not more likely, to take those commons and monetize it for their own, for profit, as our definition says, than any private citizen. Because again, the difference between a private citizen and a state there's still people in both cases. So again, to conclude, I think that the nature of our conversation, where we talk about capitalism as an economic system, has primed us to interpret things in the wrong way, and has primed us to blame a non-system as if it were a system for problems in the culture that are completely separate. And this gives cover to the true causes for these problems. At the end of the day, capitalism is not real. Capitalism does not exist because capitalism is not a system. Less regulated. There are only markets, which are places where exchanges happen, and less regulation means it is not a system. It doesn't make sense to talk about it as if it is a system unless you are trying to subvert something, unless you are trying to conjure a malicious enemy in order to justify overthrowing the status quo for other reasons. So I will and I think the counter arguments, though there are a few strong ones, ultimately fail because they're again pointing to facets of culture that are not necessarily economic. So I'll leave that for everyone to mull on, maybe come up with some counter arguments of your own. But I want to put it out there that capitalism, and especially late stage capitalism, are works of sorcery. They are fabrications, as all words are to a certain degree, designed to prime you to see things and to interpret causation in the world around you in a particular way, when in fact there are many, perhaps an infinite, many other ways of priming yourself to perceive relations in the world that don't have to do with economics at all. And some do, and that are more valid than others. But the absence of a system is the giveaway here that tells us that the sorcery is perhaps less useful than other economic systems terms, like socialism. So I will close there. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.